For my extra credit option, I chose number 1, which was to watch the first 4 minutes of Words and Numbers podcast about rhinos and elephants and their ivory tusks on the black market. So I watched the first 4 minutes of that video from Dr. Anthony and Dr. James, and I've thought about endangered species, especially rhinos, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't very educated about poaching until I listened to this podcast. And from listening to them talk, I kind of found out that rhino horns are used in Chinese medicine, but they are also used as a symbol to display success and wealth. So the demand for them is pretty high, which is causing poaching to be higher. After further research, I found that the impacts of rhino poaching is reducing biodiversity, in that rhinos are even being pushed out of their current habitats, which is leading to wildlife population declines, habitat loss, and depletion of ecosystem services, which confirms basically that we're losing nature at an unsustainable rate. So poaching can happen really anywhere, but many rhinos are targeted throughout Africa, and it's illegal, but a black market exists due to the rising demand from Southeast Asian countries. So in the podcast, they talked about a news story from several years ago about a Seattle-based tech called Pimbiant that announced a plan that would essentially 3D print rhino horns that would be a solution to poaching because they would be so undistinguishable down to the DNA. The plan was to mass produce these 3D printed rhino horns, which would drive the price of rhino horns so low that they would be no longer poachable. However, this means that you would be working against the system, and I agree with what they stated in the podcast that anytime you're working against a system, you're doomed to failure, and that instead you should work with the system. So while listening to the podcast, I heard about a book that was written called Free Our Markets that talks about different ways countries address this. One country addresses it by completely outlawing it, and another country decides to work with it and does not make it illegal, meaning that property rights are given and villagers can even have land or raise elephants. So in the country that banned elephant poaching and trade in ivory, the elephant population was decimated, and in the country that allowed trade in ivory, population grew. So basically, countries can work with the laws of economics and give people an incentive to raise and protect the elephants, but they shouldn't ban the rhino horn market because it can raise prices and make the rhino horns more profitable. I agree with most of the things that were stated in this podcast, especially that even if you ban something, people are still going to find a way to want to use it. And I think this could go along with a lot of controversies today, especially like gun laws. And some people will state that if you ban guns, then the wrong people are still going to get them in their hands. And I think that can go hand in hand with this idea. This might sound silly and might be a funny comparison, but if you think about it, it's similar because if you ban poaching, then it's just raising the prices of rhino horns, making people want to poach even more. Basically, there's a shortage of anything that has been outlawed because once something's outlawed, more people want it and it's worth more. And that's just it. The economy is very complex. And if anything, working against it will make matters worse. After listening to the podcast and realizing that I agreed with what the doctors had said, I decided to do further research. So I read an article from USA Today, and it talked about a story from Lynn Johnson, who was the founder of a nonprofit, who spoke with New York Times. And after interviewing some of the buyers of these rhino horns, she talked about how they don't want fakes and how fake rhino horns won't help reduce poaching since it doesn't address the heightened social status a rhino horn brings. And she says, quoted, calls for fake rhino horn just shows that there's a lack of understanding about the true commercial nature and consumer desire of current demand. And that's what she told New York Times. So therefore, it's not always as easy as 3D printing rhino horns and stopping poaching, and you can't always just work against the economy. Sometimes it's easiest to work with the economy and think of different solutions. Thanks.